Hey guys, on today's video, we're going to take a look at the differences from all of these phones. Now we're also going to take a look at the 16 Pro Max, but right here on camera, we've got the 16, 16 Plus, and 16 Pro. 16 Pro Max is coming right up, but let's just take a look at the differences between all of them right now. Alright, so at first we're going to take a look at the iPhone 16 Pro, 16 Plus, and 16. So here they are in order. And let's just scroll down. You guys are going to see the differences in colors. So you do have differences in colors. Keep in mind we will be taking a look at the 16 Pro Max as well. Anyways, color differences between them. Yeah, there's more colors available for the 16 Plus and 16 versus the 16 Pro. However, yeah, for the 16 Pro, you have some colors that you just don't have those options when it comes to the 16 and 16 Plus. Anyways, let's move on to more interesting stuff. You're going to look at the display. 16 Plus has a bigger display of the 16 Pro, and then the 16 has the smallest display. Now we're taking a look at the display itself. We're looking at an XDR for the 16 Pro, and then same goes with all the other guys. Now the big difference would be the Pro Motion technology that goes into 16 Pro, whereas all the other guys don't have that. 16 Pro Max has the same thing, by the way. Always on display, that has a 16 Pro. 16 Plus, 16 does not have that. What does that mean? It's just a dimmer background. So you guys know how you guys have your iPhone and it's just a black screen. Well, if you have a 16 Pro, 16 Pro Max, the screen's almost always on, but very dim. And what I found is that it doesn't really affect the battery level that much. It doesn't burn any pixels from what I've seen so far. So it's pretty good. Anyways, it's not a huge deal, by the way. Now, when you're taking a look at the phone itself, the 16 Pro has titanium with texture matte glass back. And then when you're taking a look at the 16 Plus and 16, you're looking at aluminum with color infused glass back as well. Okay, so there's aluminum between those guys and then titanium when taking a look at the Pro. All right, let's just keep going down. If you guys are going to take a look at Apple Intelligence, that's coming right up, which is Siri. Well, that's later on. Right now, it's not officially working that well. Hopefully work later on. But anyways, as for the chip itself, yep, the chip, they all have the A18, but the Pro has the A18 Pro, which means it's got one more core as well. So when you take a look at the cores and CPU, they all have the same thing, 6-core CPU. Then you take a look at the Pro that has a 6-core GPU versus right here, the 16 Plus and the 16 only have a 5-core GPU. Then they have the same thing as the 16-core neutral engine. As for the camera control on the side, they all have the same thing, so you're not missing out if you get the 16, for example. Now, if you're taking a look at the lenses, yeah, the Pro and the Pro Max, they all have like 3 lenses, whereas the 16 Plus, 16 only have 2 lenses. That's the big difference right there. Now here comes the big difference, especially when it comes to the cameras, because the Pro camera system is different. It's slightly different. So you're taking a look at 48 megapixel fusion and then taking a look at 48 megapixel ultra wide, whereas the 16 Plus and 16 just have 12 megapixel ultra wide. Now they have the same thing when it comes down to the 48 megapixel fusion though. Now we're going to take a look at the camera itself because that's the biggest thing. And if you keep scrolling down, you're going to see the same thing when it comes down to macro photography. But the 16 Pro has 48 megapixel macro photography. And then when it comes down to your video, same thing, 4K at 16 frames per second. When it comes down to the 16 Plus and 16, but the Pro has 120 frames per second available. So that's double. So if you guys want slow-mo at 4K, the 16 Pro would be it for you guys. So again, big difference between all these guys will always come down to the camera itself. And obviously the lenses, because you do have more lenses on the 16 Pro. Same thing with the 16 Pro Max, by the way. So you're taking a look at your optical zoom options. These are optical, not digital. Digital is basically you guys zooming in on your computer. That's digital. But optical is actually the lens itself. So when you're taking a look at that, your optical, then the 16 Pro has way more options. So you have that 5 times, whereas the 16 Plus and 16 don't have that 5 times. because they don't have that lens. Other than that, they have pretty much the same thing when it comes down to emergency stuff. Battery, almost the same thing except for the 16. The 16 only has 22 hours of video playback, whereas the 16 Plus and 16 Pro have 27. So better battery right there. USB-C for all of them. Now, for the Pro, it does tell you that it supports USB 3 for up to 20 times faster transfer, whereas the 16 Plus and 16, it's only USB 2. So there is a difference right there. And if you're taking a look at Face ID and all that stuff, it's the same thing. We're taking a look at your cell phone data or just getting more coverage or anything like that. They all have the exact same thing. So don't think about it that way. They all have the exact same coverage. You're not going to get better coverage just because you have a more expensive phone. Then when it comes down to charging, pretty much the same thing for all of them. You can charge them basically the same way. And price wise, well, you guys can see the price differences. You're coming down from the most expensive one, which is the 16 Pro. 16 Pro Max being the most expensive, which I'll show you in a second, where it's $1,000 for the 128 gig, and then for the 16 Plus, it's only $899, and then $100 less just for the 16. Obviously, if you get more space, then it's more expensive, but the big difference between space with all of these guys is that the 16 Plus and 16 don't have the 1 terabyte option, whereas the 16 Pro does in fact have that terabyte option for you. So you could go ahead and spend $1,500 to get a terabyte in storage. And again, you don't have those options for the 16 Plus or 16. Obviously, the 16 Pro Max also has that option. All right, now that we are taking a look at the display, they all have pretty much the same display, XDR display, but here's the big difference in size. So you're taking a look at the 16 Pro, has a 6.3 inch. Then you got the 16 Plus with a 6.7, and then the smallest one is a 16, iPhone 16 with a 6.1 inch. And they're pretty much the same thing, except for the 16 Pro, which that has that ProMotion technology, which does bring up your refresh rate at 120, which the 16 Plus 16 does not have. I already mentioned that on display always, so your display is pretty much always turned on, which that could be a plus or minus for some people. Then pixel resolution. So they all have 460 ppi, by the way. Okay, it's just because the screen size that you guys are gonna see more pixel resolution, which would have the iPhone 16 Plus, but that's because it's a bigger screen. Other than that, they all have the exact same thing as when it comes down to the brightness and all that stuff, colors, HDR, same thing comes down to the screen. Now your height and all that stuff, that's changed throughout all of them. They are all waterproof up to a certain point. So if you're thinking getting a Pro because it has better water resistance, they all have the exact same thing. Exact same thing, guys. Maximum depth up to 6 meters, 30 minutes. And that's it. And yeah, they all will have Apple Intelligence. Once it comes out, it should be good. They have pretty much the same chip, except for the fact that the Pro has that A18 chip. So that's the A18 Pro chip. And then all the other guys just have A18, but we went over that already. Now when it came down to cameras, we went over that as well. And something I think we skipped over is the fact that the Pro, the 16 Pro, also has night mode for portraits, where the 16 Plus and the 16 does not have that night mode for portraits, okay? They all have night mode, but not for portraits. And another big one is the Apple Pro RAW. That's only for the 16 Pro and Pro Max, whereas the 16 Plus does not have that, or the 16. They don't have that Apple Pro RAW option there. So you can't turn that off, that option, by the way, in your iPhone if you get one of those. Now, when it comes down to video, like I mentioned before, in your video, you can go up to 4K 120, and you do have that option of 100 frames per second, whereas the 16 Plus and 16 only have up to 60 frames per second. So that's the max you guys can get. And actually, the same thing goes with 1080. So if you guys do record your video at 1080, you do have that option to 120 frames per second, whereas they don't have that for the 16 Plus or 16, which is very interesting because they could have added the 120 frames per second at 1080. That would have been a problem. It actually has the capacity to do that. Not really sure why they took that out. Now, something interesting about the 16 Pro, it has that long video recording, whereas the 16 Plus and 16 don't. I'm not 1000% sure what that means because you can record pretty long with any of them.
but that's what it says that they don't have. And once it comes down to time lapse and all that stuff, exact same thing for all of them. The sensor, almost the same thing, because on the Pro you have the second generation sensor shift, whereas the other ones don't. They just have sensor shift optical image stabilization for video, but they don't have the second generation. So they added second generation for the Pros, which again does include the Pro Max. And then once again, when it comes down to the mic, we have a studio quality 4 mic array, where the 16 Plus, 16 does not. So the Pro has that and the other guys don't. Now when taking a look at your front camera, almost the exact same thing. So if you're taking a look at your megapixels, they'll have 12 megapixels. That's your front camera for your selfies and all that stuff. You have your smart HDR for photos. You also got the 1.9 aperture. Same thing. They all have night mode, for example. They all have the latest generation photography styles, which is not a huge deal in what I think. Now, when it comes down to your cell phone, like I said, it's the exact same thing. You're not going to get more coverage or anything different with your Pros. It's going to be the same thing for all of them. Face ID, same thing for all of them as well. They all have Apple Pay as well. You guys can add that in. That's all digital stuff, so that's why it's all the same. When it comes down to FaceTime, same deal. When you FaceTime video somebody, you will be recording at 1080p. Well, I shouldn't say recording, but you're going to be using it at 1080p, your camera, over 5G or Wi-Fi. Doesn't really matter. Your audio would be the exact same thing when it comes down to your FaceTime audio. Audio playback, same thing for all of them. Your video playback, exact same thing for all of them. The Siri, how you activate and use it, exact same thing for all of them. Now your battery, I didn't mention this, that it does depend what you use it for. But basically, usually the 16 Plus has more. But right now, from what I can see, the video playback for the 16 Pro and the 16 Plus, they have the same thing at 27 hours, whereas the 16 only has 22 hours. But when you're looking at video playback streamed, it's 24 hours for the 16 Plus and only 22 for the 16 Pro. And the 16 only has 18 hours. Same goes with right here, audio playback hours, up to 100 hours when it comes down to the 16 Plus. Then you're taking a look at 85 hours for the 16 Pro and only 80 hours for the 16. How fast can these guys charge? Same thing for all of them. They can go up to 50% in just 30 minutes. Now sensors, there is a difference. They all have the same thing except for the fact that 16 Pro does have this scanner. And if you take a look at your SIM cards, same thing. They all have eSIM as well available. So that's not a difference. And they all support USB-C. So you got that. Except for the fact that the iPhone 16 Pro and the Pro Max as well, keep in mind, they have USB 3, which is up to 10 gigs per second. So it's a lot more than the USB 2. But yeah, they all have USB-C, by the way. Now what I didn't show you is the 16 Pro Max, and that's because it's almost the exact same thing as the 16 Pro. So right now I'm gonna show you that really quick, and I put it beside the 16 Plus because of the size difference. That usually buy the Pro Max just because of the size. You just want a bigger phone. So let's just go through right away. So the 16 Pro Max is slightly bigger than the 16 Plus with a 6.9 inch. And the 16 Plus only has a 16.7, and the Pro only has 16.3, by the way. So that would be the smallest one right now that they're comparing that. Other than that, I already mentioned all this stuff. Basically, when it comes down to the 16 Pro and 16 Pro Max, it's the exact same phone except for the fact that the screen is bigger. So you take a look at how many cores it's got, the resolution of the camera, all that stuff. It's the exact same thing. So between the Pros. The Pro Max does not have a better camera, cannot record anything better. It has the same optical lenses. However, when it comes down to the battery, it's better because you got up to 33 hours of video playback on your Pro Max, whereas your Pro, just the extended Pro, only 27, and then the 16 Plus has 27 as well. And as mentioned before, the 16 Pros have that USB-C 3, so that's USB 3. Which is a lot faster than the USB 2 that the 16 Plus has. And under capacity with the Pro, you don't even have the option for 128 gig. It starts from 256 gig. So you have to buy that slightly bigger size one already, which is not bad. So especially if you're thinking about getting a 16 Pro at 256 gig, it's only $100 more just to get the Pro Max with the same storage. Now, if you're taking a look at it that way. So if you do want a bigger screen, if you're gonna get a bigger size storage, it's definitely worth it for sure. And when it comes down to the display itself, you're gonna take a look at the exact same thing. Again, it was just a size difference, but other than that, obviously because of the size difference, you're gonna get more pixels. So the 16 Pro Max will have more pixels than the 16 Plus because it's slightly bigger, or the 16 Pro. But you're taking a look at still the same number right here. See this 460 ppi? Same thing. So it's just a bigger screen, but technically same resolution if you think about it. Brightness, all that stuff is the same thing. Obviously it's bigger, so that's the biggest phone that you guys can get is the 16 Pro Max. It's slightly bigger than the 16 Plus if you compare it that size wise. Then you're taking a look at the water resistance, all that stuff is the same thing. Apple Intelligence, same thing. Now the chip and all that stuff, same thing. 16 Pro, 16 Pro Max. And like I mentioned before, they have the exact same camera, the 16 Pro Max and 16 Pro. There's no differences when it comes down to camera. There's no more options. There's nothing different there. And that includes the front camera. When you take a look at the front camera, it's still those 12 megapixel photos. Flash and all that stuff, exact same thing when it comes down to the Pros, whether you guys get the Max or the just standard Pro. When it comes down to your Bluetooth and all that stuff, exact same thing for all of them actually. So when you take a look at bigger phones, it's always the screen and you're taking a look at more hours. So like I mentioned before, we got more hours out of the Pro Max than the 16 Plus or the Pro. And same goes with audio. You get 105 hours of audio playback, whereas the 16 Plus, you get 100, and then the 16 Pro only has 85 hours. So again, the winner would be the 16 Pro Max. And then when it comes down to sensors, same thing as the 16 Pro, so we went over that already. SIM card, same thing for all of them, and then that would be it. So basically, before when I showed you all the differences between the 16 Pro and all the other phones, it would have been the same thing as the Pro Max. It's just a bigger screen, more battery life, and that's about it. But anyways, that would be it for today's video. If you guys have any comments, questions, you guys can write down here in the comments area. Don't forget to subscribe and like. Thank you.